calling this the When Congress Tanks the Nation Dream. And that tank is not thanks. It's not a different name. It is a military-style vehicle, and as you hear the dream, you'll understand what it is. But I'm going to read through it. Okay, so the When Congress Tanks the Nation Dream. April 13th, May 18th, 2024. This dream began with 4 billboards around Washington, D.C., and they were situated around the 4 corners of the city. The first one had a picture of the city riots in 2020 in Minneapolis and the West Coast. So I saw pictures of George Floyd and Portland and Seattle and some of the crazy things happening there. The second one had a picture of the college campus protest that we've seen recently in the news. The very, very anti-Semitic and really, really going against the nation of Israel. The third, and this has not happened yet, so I'm believing this is a prophetic part of the dream. The third had pictures of state houses and courthouses being surrounded by aggressive protesters. They were shouting, they were throwing rocks at buildings, and I'm talking like your local courthouse, your state house where your governor's at, in your capital city. They also had banners or billboards, or not billboards, but like pieces of cardboard with things written on them. They had torches and pitchforks. These people were angry and mad, and they had surrounded basically the state and local leaders. The fourth one had the words, "You won't believe what comes next," with a picture of the White House on fire. And I will say very clearly, I don't think this is not a prophetic thing that the White House is going to burn. But there's a whole lot of things happening within the White House right now, looking towards the election. Next part of the dream. Then I was inside the Capitol building, and its members were at the wall behind where the speaker stands. So if you watch the State of the Union address, the wall right behind them. And the members of Congress and the senators, they were hitting that back wall with sledgehammers and axes, and they were trying to tear it down. They were trying to get that wall to come down. And then suddenly, it was this loud, hard rock beat. And the most clear thing I can think of was like Another One Bites the Dust. That the Queen had a song like that back in the early 80s. It was just that constant bass, drum, beating, constant sound. Okay? And it was coming from behind that wall. And the leaders all backed away from that wall, and they got down on their hands and their knees. Then they started raising their hands like in a state of worship. If you've been in a Pentecostal church or a lively worship church, you know what I'm talking about. Hands in the air, on their knees. This was like a state of worship. And the wall began to shake, and the ground began to shake. So as they're trying to break it down, now it's starting to fall apart. And then the wall begins to crumble. And smoke poured out. And the music, or that steady beat, just kept getting louder and louder and louder. And suddenly, 2 Asian women in black military gear and swords flipped into the room from that wall that had come down in a very impressive gymnastics display. Very similar to the one that I saw in another earlier dream, where she came tumbling or came, acrobating down the aisle and ends up on that place where the State of the Union address is given. Okay? These 2 women landed on the side of the podium, and they held their swords, these samurai swords, above their heads with both hands, looking very aggressive. And I want to be very cautious in how I say this. One was wearing a Chinese flag brooch on the right side of her chest, and the other was wearing a South Korean flag brooch on her left side of her chest. And they spoke in unison, and both of them at the very same time said, "His Spirit is here." They maintained that position with the swords above their head, and they said, "His Spirit is here." And a man wearing a very expensive suit and tie walked through the rubble of the back wall and came to the podium. The leaders on the ground then began to howl like animals. And they bowed and they cried before this man, and it was a display of worship that was ridiculously insane. And there was perversion and all sorts of sexual fornication, and just, it was awful. The faces were awful. It was almost as if they were demon possessed, but they were worshiping this leader. And there was a great amount of perversion among the leaders of the Congress and the Senate, and was done without shame or fear of being seen. The man at the podium spoke, and he said, "I have been adored by you for many years. So now go and prepare the road for the man who is coming." At that moment, all the leaders got up salivating. They were like slobbering. It was like the snot was running down their nose, and slobber and spit running out of their mouth. It was almost like they were raving in that sense. They were biting their own tongues. Blood was flowing down all their chins. And they ran as fast as they could through the foyer, basically, of the Capitol building. And then they lined up before heading outside. So you have this crazy, ridiculous, they're running, they're screaming, they're yelling, and they stop suddenly and they get lined up perfectly. The doors were opened by well-dressed men. And I mean like butlers, like the suits and the hats, the top hat things. And they showed very much respect towards these wild leaders. And they even offered towels to these men and women so they could wipe the blood from their faces. But the leaders all refused any possibility of cleaning themselves up. And once outside, they were each escorted by law enforcement into small military-style tanks. It wasn't quite the size of a Sherman tank, smaller, but they were going to be able to do a lot of devastation. And so they get in these tanks and they speed off, and they're running over people. They're hitting vehicles. They're running over things at the Capitol, statues and things like that. They were going all in different directions, and everywhere they went they left destruction. But even though they were going in different directions, they obviously headed through the city of D.C. and then towards the outskirts. And I'm watching them as they're going quickly, and they're aiming for people. They're trying to run them down, and people are panicking. They're screaming, they're yelling, they're crying, and they're dying in the street. I literally saw that. I watched the smoke and flames were left in their path. I saw people being ran over by those in front and then ran over again by those in the back. And one tank stopped, and a man opened the hatch. He stuck his head out, and he screamed in a very slow and sinister way, "Kill them all." And I want to stop at this moment and just say this. Many of you may remember in the late 1980s, Governor Dukakis from Massachusetts ran for the Democratic Party. And this picture, there was a picture of him in a tank with this military-style hat or helmet that was on his head. And he was mocked, he was laughed at, he was way out of character, he did not fit the scene. It was not Dukakis in this, but it reminded me very much of that situation. And then when he got back into the tank, he left the hatch door open like this. And he sped off. And as he took off quickly, that hatch door was doing this. It was bouncing up and bouncing down, very rhythmic, and it reminded me of the beat and the music that was going on when the wall was coming down and the spirit of the Antichrist was there, basically saying, hey, these things. So it was rhythmic, it was melodic, it was, and people were turning and seeing this thing coming, and then he would run over them. I mean, it was horrible. It was one of the most violent dreams I've ever had as far as this goes. That hatch door was banging up and down like a drum, and it kept beating as far as I could see him go. So as I'm watching him go, I can still see it beating up and down, going back and forth, but I hear it. It's just that steady beat. And people were panicking. People were running and screaming. And at this point, I started walking and observing the chaos and the destruction. All of the dead were face down, and they had their hands covering their ears. I turned one of the bodies over to check for signs of life, and when I did, even though the person was dead, the hands over the ears moved and covered their eyes, and it stayed there. It was creepy even to me in the dream, because they were dead, but yet they were moving their heads so they couldn't hear the truth or see the truth in that regards. And I jumped back startled by this, but then I noticed the t-shirt that the man who had turned over was wearing. It had this phrase, U.S. Congress working for you. I kept walking, but I was watching my steps carefully because the roads and the sidewalks had really been torn up by the tanks. I was watching the ground carefully when I saw the man I always see. He was walking to my right, and I stopped, and he stopped. I watched him look around and shake his head at what he was seeing. And then he stepped up on the podium of a statue that had been knocked over by the tank brigade, and he just kept looking. He just kept looking at the destruction. And then he said this, since the garden, man has hated himself enough to put a chain around their own throat and call it freedom. Governments have become a collective threat. And that phrase stood out in my mind too. Governments have become a collective threat. And the Antichrist spirit has led the nations and yours for many years. But you who know me are to stand out for the truth, even if it means your death. And when it does, I will be waiting on the other side of eternity to embrace and welcome you. But for now, brace your position, brace your faith, and brace your minds. For the time of testing will increase and test every one of you who are in me. Let me read that again. For the time of testing will increase and test every one of you who are in me. Stay rooted and grounded, humble in sharing your faith, taking your cross daily into the darkened world so very close to you. I'm reminded of that verse that says we're in the world but not of the world. But he said, take your cross daily into the darkened world that is so very close to you. And always remember. And in this moment, there was a little bit of a slight smile on his face. He says, and always remember, ready or not. And at that moment, for 2 solid weeks, every time I'd get to that place in the dream, I would wake up. So, most of us know what follows the phrase, ready or not. So, I was telling Sheree earlier, I couldn't sleep last night, and when I did, my dreams were just chaotic and all over the place. I probably spent more time praying about this dream than any other dream I've had. I probably got 75 to 80 hours of prayer in this dream. The last week it's not been horrible or terrible, but I can always tell when I get closer to sharing a dream, there's just certain kind of attacks and things that happen. This one has been unparalleled for me. And so I know Sheree told me you turned your ankle or some other things were going on. And then us even contacting, we've not really talked about the dream until about 11:30 today. My schedule, your schedule, things going on here and there. And so you're hearing it extremely fresh today. But I've got absolute confidence in Sheree. I know what I sense and see and hear and feel with this. So Sheree, go ahead and begin to share what your thoughts are.